The sound of gunfire echoed through the narrow canyon as Beatrice Conrad pressed her body against the rough stone wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a wild Mustang. Blood from a graze wound on her arm soaked through her once pristine blue dress, the fabric now torn and mudded from her desperate flight. 3 days on the run had left her exhausted, but the men pursuing her wouldn't rest until she was dead, not after what she had witnessed. The year was 1872, and Beatrice had never imagined her life would come to this. 6 months ago, she had been teaching school in San Francisco, leading a quiet, respectable life. Now she was fleeing through the wilderness of the Sierra Nevada foothills with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small leather pouch containing her life savings. Another shot ricocheted off the rocks above her head, sending stone chips raining down. Beatrice stifled a scream and pushed herself away from the wall. She had to keep moving. Twilight was approaching, and if she could just make it to nightfall, she might have a chance to disappear. She went this way, a gruff voice called out, too close for comfort. Remember what Hollister said, no witnesses. Beatrice's legs burned with exhaustion as she scrambled up a steep incline, her fingers clawing at rocks and roots for purchase. The hem of her dress caught on a jagged stone and she yanked it free, hearing the fabric tear. It didn't matter now. Nothing mattered except escape. As she crested the hill, Beatrice saw a valley spread out below her, and in the distance, the faint glow of lanterns marking a small settlement. Hangtown. She had heard of the place, a mining town with a grim name and an even grimmer history. But right now, those distant lights represented her only hope. The sound of hoofbeats echoed up from below. Her pursuers were mounting up again, preparing to circle around the canyon. Beatrice took a deep breath and began her descent toward the town, trying to keep to the shadows of the pine trees that dotted the hillside. Night had fallen by the time she reached the outskirts of Hangtown. The main street was alive with the sounds of piano music and raucous laughter spilling from saloons. Beatrice kept to the shadows, knowing her disheveled appearance would draw unwanted attention. She needed somewhere to hide, somewhere safe. As she slipped down a side alley, a door suddenly swung open, spilling lamplight across her path. Beatrice froze, her heart in her throat. A tall man stood silhouetted in the doorway, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. "You look like you're in a heap of trouble, madam," he said, his voice low and steady. Beatrice took a step back, ready to run again, but her legs finally betrayed her. She swayed on her feet, light-headed from hunger and exhaustion. The man moved quickly, catching her before she collapsed. "Easy now," he murmured. Up close, she could see his face, weathered but kind, with eyes the color of the summer sky. He couldn't have been more than 30 years old, but there was an ageless quality to his gaze, as though he had seen more than his share of hardship. "They'll kill me if they find me," she whispered, her voice ragged. The stranger glanced past her toward the main street, his expression hardening as he heard voices calling out, questioning the townsfolk. Without another word, he lifted Beatrice into his arms and carried her through the doorway, kicking it shut behind them. "Name's Brody Weston," he said, setting her gently on a wooden chair in what appeared to be the back room of a stable. "And it seems like you've gotten yourself into something fierce, miss." "Conrad," she replied weakly. "Beatrice Conrad, and yes, Mr. Weston, I'm afraid I have." Brody moved to the small window, peering through a gap in the curtains. "Those men out there, they've been asking questions all over town since yesterday. Said they're looking for a thief." Beatrice stiffened. "I'm no thief, Mr. Weston. I'm a schoolteacher from San Francisco, or I was until—" Her voice trailed off as memories of that terrible night flooded back. "Until what?" Brody asked, turning to face her. "Until I saw Judge Hollister murder a man." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "A Chinese merchant who had evidence of the judge's involvement with the railroad land schemes. I was working late at the school and my classroom window overlooks the alley behind the courthouse. I saw everything." Brody whistled low. "Judge Ethan Hollister, the man's got connections all the way to Sacramento. He saw me watching. Beatrice continued, her hands trembling in her lap. I ran that night, took the first stage out of the city, but his men were close behind. They've been tracking me for days. The sound of boots on the boardwalk outside made them both freeze. Brody moved swiftly, placing his finger to his lips as he extinguished the lamp. In the sudden darkness, Beatrice could hear men's voices just outside the stable. "Check every building on this street," a harsh voice commanded. She couldn't have gotten far. The boss is paying $50 to whoever finds her first. Brody's hand found Beatrice's in the darkness, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "There's a small space beneath the floorboards where I keep valuables," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "It's not comfortable, but it'll hide you." He led her to a corner of the room and lifted a section of the wooden floor, revealing a narrow space barely large enough for a person. Beatrice didn't hesitate. She lowered herself into the hiding place, trying not to think about spiders or what else might be sharing the space with her. "Stay absolutely silent no matter what you hear," Brody instructed as he prepared to replace the boards. "I'll handle this." "Why are you helping me?" Beatrice asked, the question escaping before she could think better of it. "You don't know me, I could be exactly what they claim." In the dim light filtering through the window, she saw Brody's mouth curve into a slight smile. "Let's just say I've got my own reasons to dislike men who abuse their power." Now, not another sound. The floorboards closed above her, and Beatrice was plunged into darkness. She could hear Brody moving around the room and then the sound of the door opening. Heavy footsteps entered the stable. "Evening, gentlemen." Brody's voice was casual, betraying none of the tension Beatrice had heard moments before. "Something I can help you with." "We're looking for a woman," a gruff voice responded. "Dark hair, blue dress, might be injured. Seen anyone matching that description? Can't say that I have. Not many ladies visit the livery at this hour or any hour for that matter." There was a pause, and Beatrice held her breath, pressing her hand over her mouth to ensure not even the slightest sound escaped. "Mind if we look around?" the man asked, though his tone suggested it wasn't really a question. "As a matter of fact, I do mind," Brody replied, his voice hardening. "This is private property, and I don't recall seeing any badges on you boys." "We're working for Judge Hollister out of San Francisco," another voice said. "This woman's a thief and a murderer, killed the judge's clerk and stole court documents." Beatrice nearly gasped at the lie but caught herself just in time. "That's so." Brody sounded unimpressed. "Well, if I see a murderous female thief, I'll be sure to let the sheriff know. Now, if you don't mind, I've got work to do." "You're making a mistake, mister," the first man growled. "Judge Hollister rewards those who help him, crosses those who don't." "I'll keep that in mind," Brody replied evenly. "Good night, gentlemen." Tense seconds passed before Beatrice heard the door close. She didn't dare move, afraid the men might still be nearby. After what seemed like an eternity, the floorboards above her lifted and Brody's face appeared. "They're gone for now," he said, offering his hand to help her out of the hiding place. "But they'll be back, and they'll be watching the roads out of town." Beatrice climbed out, her muscles stiff from being cramped in the small space. "I can't stay here. I've already put you in danger just by being seen with me." "You don't have many options, Miss Conrad." Brody lit the lamp again, its warm glow revealing the concern on his face. "Those men mean business, and there are at least 6 of them in town that I've counted." Beatrice sank back into the chair, the reality of her situation crashing down upon her. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice small. "I thought if I could just get far enough away, perhaps to Carson City or even Denver, I could find a marshal or someone who would listen to my story. But they're always right behind me." Brody was silent for a moment, studying her with those penetrating blue eyes. "You need rest and food first," he finally said. "And those wounds need tending. I've got a small room above the stable. It's not fancy, but it's clean, and no one will look for you there." "Why are you helping me?" Beatrice asked again, searching his face for any sign of ulterior motives. Brody's expression darkened momentarily. "Let's just say I've had my own run-ins with men who think their wealth and position put them above the law. 5 years ago, men like that took something from me I can never get back. There was pain in his voice that resonated with Beatrice's own grief. I'm sorry, she said softly. He shook his head as if shaking off the memory. It's in the past. Right now, we need to focus on keeping you alive. He reached for a canteen and offered it to her. Drink this, then we'll get you upstairs where you can rest. The water was cool and sweet, and Beatrice hadn't realized how desperately thirsty she was until the first drop touched her lips. She drank deeply, then allowed Brody to help her to her feet. Thank you, Mr. Weston, she said, suddenly aware of how close he was standing, of the strength in the arm that supported her. Brody, he corrected with a small smile. If we're going to be hiding from killers together, we might as well use first names. Despite everything, Beatrice found herself returning his smile. Brody, then, and please call me Beatrice. He led her up a narrow staircase at the back of the stable to a small but neat room with a bed, a washstand, and a trunk. A single window looked out over the back of the property to the hills beyond. It's not much, Brody said, almost apologetically. It's perfect, Beatrice assured him, overcome with gratitude just to have a safe place to rest. Brody nodded, a hint of color touching his cheeks. I'll fetch some hot water and something for those cuts. There's a clean shirt in the trunk if you want to change. After he left, Beatrice sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the past days catching up with her all at once. She hadn't allowed herself to truly feel her fear until now, when a moment of safety made it possible to acknowledge how close she had come to death. When Brody returned with a basin of steaming water and a small bundle under his arm, he found Beatrice with silent tears streaming down her face. Hey now, he said gently, setting down his burdens and kneeling before her. You're safe for the moment, we'll figure this out. Beatrice wiped at her tears, embarrassed by her show of weakness. I'm sorry, it's just been so overwhelming. No need to apologize for being human, Brody said, his voice kind. He unwrapped the bundle, revealing bread, cheese, and dried apple slices. Eat something while I tend to that arm. As she ate, Brody carefully cleaned the graze wound on her arm. His touch was surprisingly gentle for a man with such calloused hands. It's not too deep, he said, wrapping a clean bandage around it. Should heal fine if we keep it clean. Where did you learn to do this? Beatrice asked, curious about this quiet man who had taken such a risk to help her. Army, he replied simply. Served 4 years, much of it on the frontier. You learn quick how to patch up wounds when the nearest doctor might be 100 miles away. He worked in silence for a few moments, then asked, So how does a schoolteacher end up witnessing a murder committed by one of California's most powerful judges? Beatrice sighed, the memory still raw. I was grading essays late in the evening. My classroom is on the second floor of a building that backs up to the alley behind the courthouse. I heard voices, angry voices, and went to the window. That's when I saw them. Judge Hollister and another man I didn't recognize were arguing with Mr. Chen, a merchant who supplied many of the businesses in Chinatown. She paused, the scene replaying in her mind. Mr. Chen was waving some papers, saying they were proof of corruption. The judge. He just nodded to the other man who pulled out a knife. It happened so fast. Mr. Chen tried to run, but she shuddered. The judge looked up and saw me watching. I ran immediately, gathered what little money I had, and fled that night. They've been after me ever since. Brody's expression had hardened as he listened. And the papers, the evidence? I don't know what happened to it. I assume they took it from Mr. Chen's body. Brody nodded thoughtfully. Finish eating and get some rest. I'll sleep downstairs to keep watch. Aren't you afraid? Beatrice asked. These men, they won't hesitate to kill you too if they discover you're helping me. A grim smile touched Brody's lips. I've faced worse odds, Beatrice, and I never could abide a bully, especially ones who hide behind badges or titles. As he turned to leave, Beatrice caught his hand. Thank you, Brody, truly. His fingers tightened briefly around hers. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we'll figure out our next move. After he left, Beatrice changed into the offered shirt, which hung to her knees and washed as best she could with the basin of water. The simple bed felt like the most luxurious feather mattress to her exhausted body, and despite her anxiety, sleep claimed her almost immediately. She dreamed of running, endlessly running, with faceless men always just behind her. Then suddenly, in the way of dreams, she was back in San Francisco, but this time she wasn't merely a witness. In the dream, she was standing over Mr. Chen's body, a knife in her hand. While Judge Hollister smiled coldly at her, Beatrice woke with a gasp, her heart racing. Pale dawn light filtered through the small window, and for a moment she couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back: the chase, Hangtown, and Brody Weston, the stranger who had risked his life to help her. A soft knock at the door preceded Brody's entrance. He carried a tray with coffee, biscuits, and a small pot of what smelled like honey. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, setting the tray on the trunk. "How's the arm feeling?" Beatrice flexed it experimentally. "Sore, but better, thank you for the food," Brody nodded, moving to the window to look out. "Hollister's men are still in town. They've posted one at each end of the main street, watching everyone who comes and goes." "I need to leave," Beatrice said, the familiar panic rising in her chest. "I can't stay here and put you in danger." "And go where?" Brody turned to face her, his expression serious. "They'll be watching the roads, and a woman traveling alone would draw their attention immediately." "Then what do you suggest?" Beatrice asked, reaching for the coffee. The warm mug felt reassuring in her hands. Brody sat on the edge of the trunk, his tall frame making the small room seem even smaller. "I've been thinking about that. You need to get to someone with the authority to hear your testimony against Hollister. That means a federal marshal or a circuit judge." "The nearest federal office would be in Sacramento," Beatrice said, remembering the geography of the region. "Too risky," Brody shook his head. "That's Hollister's territory. He'd have men watching every approach." "Then where?" "Carson City," Brody said decisively. "It's in Nevada territory, beyond Hollister's immediate influence. Judge Reynolds holds court there, and he's known to be an honest man." Beatrice's heart leaped with hope. "Carson City is east of here, isn't it? Over the mountains," Brody nodded. "It's not an easy journey, especially this time of year. The passes can be treacherous, but I know a route that's less traveled. I used to guide supply wagons through these mountains." "You're proposing to come with me?" Beatrice asked, surprised. "You think I'd send you off on your own after going to all this trouble to keep you alive?" There was a hint of teasing in his voice, but his eyes were serious. "I can't ask that of you," Beatrice protested. "You've already done more than enough. These men, they're killers, Brody. All the more reason you shouldn't face them alone." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Listen, Beatrice, the livery business here, it's not really mine. I'm just running it for an old friend who's laid up with a broken leg. I was planning to move on soon anyway." "But why risk your life for a stranger?" Beatrice couldn't understand his willingness to put himself in danger for her. A shadow passed over Brody's face. "Because 5 years ago, I witnessed something similar to what you saw. A powerful man doing something terrible. Only I didn't have the courage to speak up, to do what was right. Someone else paid the price for my silence." He stood abruptly, as if uncomfortable with having revealed so much. "We'll leave tonight after dark. I know a back trail out of town that Hollister's men won't be watching. I'll make preparations today: food, supplies, horses." Beatrice set down her coffee and stood as well. "I have some money," she said, reaching for the small leather pouch she had kept with her. "It's not much, but it should help with the supplies." Brody waved her offer away. "Keep it. We might need it later." He moved to the door, then paused. "Stay here today, keep away from the window, I'll be back this evening." After he left, Beatrice found herself pacing the small room, her mind racing with thoughts of the journey ahead. Carson City was at least 100 miles away, over mountain terrain. It would be a difficult journey under the best circumstances, let alone while being hunted. She wondered about Brody's past, about the regret that had flashed in his eyes when he spoke of his own failure to stand up to injustice. What had he witnessed? Who had paid the price he mentioned, the day passed slowly. Beatrice dozed intermittently, still recovering from her days on the run. By late afternoon, she was restless and anxious. Had Hollister's men discovered her hiding place, had they arrested Brody? The uncertainty was almost worse than the active pursuit had been. Just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the floor of the small room, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Beatrice tensed, looking around for anything she might use as a weapon. But it was Brody who entered, carrying a bundle of clothing. "Found these," he said, setting them on the bed. "They belonged to my friend's daughter before she married and moved east. Should fit you better than my shirts." Beatrice examined the clothes: a simple brown skirt, cream-colored blouse, and a sturdy riding jacket. "These are perfect, thank you." "There's something else," Brody said, his expression grave. "One of Hollister's men recognized me today, asked questions about my past where I served in the army. I think they might suspect I'm helping you." Beatrice's heart sank. "Oh, Brody, I'm so sorry." "Don't be. It just means we need to move sooner rather than later. Can you be ready to leave in an hour?" She nodded firmly. "I'll be ready." "Good. Change into these clothes and pack anything you want to take with you. I'll meet you downstairs." An hour later, dressed in her new attire with her hair braided and tucked under a wide-brimmed hat, Beatrice descended the stairs to find Brody waiting with 2 saddled horses. "The black gelding is yours," he said, patting the animal's neck. "His name's Thunder. He's steady on mountain trails." Beatrice approached the horse, who regarded her with intelligent eyes. She stroked his velvety nose, grateful for Brody's thoughtfulness in selecting a mount she could manage. "I've packed food, blankets, and some basic supplies," Brody continued, checking the cinch on his own mount, a sturdy chestnut mare. "We'll travel light and fast. With any luck, we can be halfway to Carson City before they realize we've gone." "And if they do realize?" Beatrice asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice. Brody's hand moved briefly to the revolver at his hip. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens. Ready?" Beatrice took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready." They led the horses out the back door of the stable and through a narrow alley that wound behind the buildings of Hangtown. The night was clear, with a half-moon providing just enough light to see by. Beatrice could hear the distant sounds of the saloons on the main street, but here behind the buildings, all was quiet. Brody moved with confidence, guiding them toward the eastern edge of town. Just as they were about to emerge onto a side road, he suddenly pulled back, signaling for Beatrice to halt. Voices drifted toward them, men speaking in low tones, the words indistinct but the tone unmistakably tense. "2 of them," Brody whispered, "watching the east road." "What do we do?" Beatrice whispered back, fear clutching at her throat. Brody thought for a moment, then led her back several paces to a narrow space between 2 buildings. "Wait here with the horses. I'll create a distraction." Before she could protest, he had slipped away into the darkness. Beatrice stood frozen, one hand on Thunder's bridle to keep him calm, the other pressed against her racing heart. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Then suddenly, from the far side of town, came the sound of shouting, followed by the unmistakable crack of gunfire. "Fire!" Someone yelled. "Fire at the saloon!" More shouts followed, and Beatrice heard running footsteps as the men who had been guarding the road rushed toward the commotion. Brody appeared beside her so suddenly she nearly cried out in surprise. "Now," he said urgently, "while they're distracted." They mounted quickly and rode out onto the road, keeping to a trot until they were well clear of the town's buildings. Only then did they spur their horses to a gallop, racing east toward the looming shadows of the Sierra Nevada. After nearly an hour of hard riding, Brody finally signaled for them to slow. The horses were breathing heavily, steam rising from their flanks in the cool night air. "What did you do back there?" Beatrice asked as they settled into a more sustainable pace. A smile quirked the corner of Brody's mouth. "Lit a small fire in a trash barrel behind the Silver Dollar Saloon, made sure it looked worse than it was, then fired a couple of shots in the air. Town like Hangtown, fire's the one thing everyone responds to." That was quick thinking, Beatrice said admiringly. Don't celebrate too soon, Brody cautioned. They'll realize it was a distraction as soon as they get the fire under control and when they find us gone. He didn't need to finish the thought. They rode in silence for a while, the trail gradually climbing as they entered the foothills of the mountains. The moon provided enough light to see the path, but Beatrice knew they would need to stop and rest eventually. How far will we go tonight? She asked, her body already protesting the hours in the saddle after days of exhaustion. There's a small cabin about 5 more miles up this trail, Brody replied. Belonged to an old prospector named Illy. He died last winter, but the place should still be standing. We can rest there until dawn, then continue on. The trail grew steeper and narrower as they climbed, forcing them to proceed in single file. Brody led the way, occasionally glancing back to ensure Beatrice was managing the difficult terrain. Despite her fatigue, she was determined not to slow them down, and Thunder proved to be as sure-footed as Brody had promised. It was well past midnight when they finally reached the cabin, a small, sturdy structure nestled against the side of the mountain. It looked abandoned but intact, its single window dark and empty. Brody dismounted and helped Beatrice down, her legs stiff and sore from the long ride. "Let me check inside first," he said, drawing his revolver. The cabin door creaked as he pushed it open, disappearing into the darkness within. A moment later, a soft glow appeared as he lit a lamp. "All clear," he called. Beatrice entered to find a simple one-room cabin with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed in one corner. A layer of dust covered everything, but otherwise, the place seemed remarkably preserved. "We'll need a fire," Brody said, moving to the hearth. "The nights get cold up here even in summer." While he built a fire, Beatrice tended to the horses, unsaddling them and rubbing them down as best she could. Brody had brought grain for them, which she measured out carefully, knowing they would need the animals' strength in the days ahead. By the time she returned to the cabin, Brody had a small fire crackling in the hearth and had cleared most of the dust from the table and chairs. He was unpacking their supplies, laying out bread, dried meat, and a canteen of water. "It's not a feast," he said apologetically, "but it'll keep our strength up." "It looks wonderful," Beatrice assured him, suddenly ravenous. She sat at the table and accepted the food he offered, savoring each bite as if it were the finest cuisine. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the fire casting flickering shadows across the cabin walls. Beatrice found herself studying Brody's face in the firelight, noticing the small scar that ran along his jawline, the slight crease between his brows that suggested he frowned more often than he smiled. "Tell me about yourself," she said impulsively. "Before all this, before Hangtown." Brody looked surprised by the question, but after a moment he set down his food and leaned back in his chair. "Not much to tell. I grew up on a small ranch in Texas, joined the Army at 18, served 4 years on the frontier. After that, I drifted, taking work where I could find it. Family." Beatrice asked, a shadow passed over his face. "Parents died of fever when I was 16, no siblings." "I'm sorry," she said softly, regretting her question. Brody shrugged, his expression unreadable. "It was a long time ago. What about you?" "How does a woman end up teaching school in San Francisco?" Beatrice smiled, grateful for the change of subject. "My father was a professor at a small college in Massachusetts. He believed in education for everyone, including girls. When he died 3 years ago, I decided to come west. There was a shortage of qualified teachers, and San Francisco seemed like an adventure." "Was it? An adventure, I mean." "It was," she admitted, "though not always in ways I expected. The city is so different from the small New England town where I grew up. So many people from different parts of the world all living together. It's fascinating." "And your mother?" Brody asked. "She died when I was very young. I barely remember her." Beatrice traced a pattern in the dust on the table. "My father never remarried. He said no one could compare to her." Brody nodded, understanding in his eyes. "It can be that way sometimes. One person leaves such a mark on your heart that there's no room for anyone else. There was something in his tone that made Beatrice wonder if he spoke from experience. Had Brody Weston loved and lost someone? Was that part of the regret she sometimes glimpsed in his eyes? "You should take the bed," Brody said, interrupting her thoughts. "I'll keep watch for a while, then sleep by the fire." Beatrice wanted to protest, to insist that he needed rest too, but the events of the day had caught up with her, and she could barely keep her eyes open. "Wake me in a few hours," she said. "You need sleep too." Brody just nodded, though Beatrice suspected he had no intention of waking her. She was too exhausted to argue further. Removing only her boots and jacket, she lay down on the narrow bed, pulling the blanket Brody had provided over herself. Despite her fatigue, she found herself watching him as he moved about the cabin, checking the windows, adding wood to the fire. There was a quiet competence to everything he did, a reassuring solidity to his presence. In the few short hours since they'd met, Beatrice had come to trust this man with her life. As if sensing her gaze, Brody turned and met her eyes across the room. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of the strange intimacy that danger had forced upon them. "Sleep," he said gently. "We have a long journey ahead." Beatrice closed her eyes, letting the crackling of the fire and the soft sounds of Brody moving around the cabin lull her into a dreamless sleep. She woke to the smell of coffee and the soft gray light of dawn filtering through the cabin's single window. For a moment, disorientation gripped her, but then the events of the previous day came rushing back. Sitting up, she saw Brody crouched by the fire, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. He looked up at her movement and offered a small smile. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "Coffee's hot." "You didn't wake me," Beatrice accused mildly, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. "You needed the rest more than I did," Brody replied simply, handing her a cup. The coffee was strong and bitter, but wonderfully warming. Beatrice cupped her hands around the mug, savoring the heat that seeped into her cold fingers. "What's our plan for today?" she asked after taking a few sips. Brody moved to the window, peering out at the mountainside. "We'll follow the old mining trail up to Carson Pass, then down the eastern slope toward Carson City. If we push hard, we might make it in 3 days. And if Hollister's men follow us, they will," Brody said grimly. "But they'll have to pick up our trail first, and I've been careful to keep to rocky ground where we won't leave many tracks." They ate a quick breakfast of jerky and hardtack, then packed their few belongings. Outside, the morning was clear and cool, with a light breeze stirring the pine trees that surrounded the cabin. Brody saddled the horses while Beatrice obliterated any signs of their stay, scattering the ashes from the fire and sweeping away their footprints with a branch. "Ready?" Brody asked as she emerged from the cabin, closing the door behind her. Beatrice nodded, accepting his help to mount Thunder. Her muscles protested after the previous day's ride, but she knew they would loosen as they traveled. The trail grew steeper and more challenging as they climbed higher into the mountains. In places, it was barely visible, overgrown with brush and blocked by fallen trees. Brody seemed to navigate by instinct, occasionally dismounting to clear obstacles or scout ahead. By midday, they had reached a high meadow where a clear stream provided water for themselves and the horses. While the animals drank and grazed on the lush grass, Beatrice and Brody rested in the shade of a tall pine. "It's beautiful up here," Beatrice remarked, looking out over the vista of mountains and valleys spread below them. "It is," Brody agreed, his eyes scanning the trail behind them for any sign of pursuit. "When I first came to California, I thought I might settle in the mountains. There's a peace here you don't find in the towns." "Why didn't you?" Beatrice asked, curious. Brody was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "It was after the army I was restless, couldn't seem to stay in one place too long." Beatrice sensed there was more to the story but didn't press. Instead, she asked, "And what about after Carson City, after we find someone to hear my testimony?" "If we make it to Carson City," Brody corrected, his tone cautious. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. When we make it to Carson City, Beatrice insisted, refusing to consider failure. A small smile touched Brody's lips at her determination. Then I imagine you'll be asked to stay until there's a formal investigation, maybe even a trial. As for me, he shrugged, I haven't thought that far ahead. The idea that they might soon part ways left Beatrice with an unexpected sense of loss. In the short time she had known Brody Weston, she had come to rely on his strength, his quiet competence, his unwavering support. The thought of facing the uncertain future without him was more disturbing than she wanted to admit. We should keep moving, Brody said, rising to his feet and offering her his hand. I want to reach the high pass before nightfall. As Beatrice allowed him to pull her up, their hands lingered together a moment longer than necessary. Something flickered in Brody's eyes, a warmth that hadn't been there before, but it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. They rode on through the afternoon, the trail becoming increasingly difficult as they climbed. In some places, it was so narrow and steep that they had to dismount and lead the horses on foot. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered over the peaks ahead, and a distant rumble of thunder warned of an approaching storm. We need to find shelter, Brody said, eyeing the sky with concern. Storms up here can be vicious. Is there another cabin nearby? Beatrice asked, pulling her jacket tighter against the cooling air. No, but there's a cave about a mile ahead that miners used to use as a way station. It should provide adequate shelter. They pushed on, the wind rising and the temperature dropping as the storm drew nearer. Thunder, true to his name, grew nervous at the sound of his atmospheric namesake, and Beatrice had to work to keep him calm. The first heavy drops of rain were just beginning to fall when Brody led them off the trail and into a stand of dense pine trees. Behind the trees, nestled against the mountainside, was the opening to a cave. Get the horses inside, Brody instructed as lightning split the sky overhead. They led the animals into the cave just as the rain began to pour in earnest. The interior was larger than Beatrice had expected, extending back into the mountain for at least 30 feet. The floor was relatively flat and dry, with signs that others had used the space before: old fire rings, bits of discarded equipment, even crude shelves carved into the rock walls. This will do nicely, Beatrice said, relief evident in her voice as she removed Thunder's saddle. Brody was less relaxed, his eyes constantly moving to the cave entrance. I'm going to gather some firewood before everything gets soaked, he said, drawing his revolver and handing it to Beatrice. Keep this with you. If anyone besides me approaches, don't hesitate to use it. The weight of the weapon felt strange in her hand, but Beatrice nodded solemnly. Be careful. While Brody was gone, she busied herself with settling the horses and arranging their supplies. The cave was cool but not uncomfortably so, and she found herself grateful for its solid walls and roof as the storm raged outside. Brody returned quickly, his arms full of branches and kindling, his hair and shoulders wet from the rain. He built a small fire near the cave entrance, positioning it so that the smoke would be drawn outward by the wind. The rain should cover our tracks, he said as he worked, but it will also make the trail more dangerous tomorrow. At least we're safe for tonight, Beatrice replied, spreading their blankets near the fire. As darkness fell outside, the storm intensified, with lightning illuminating the cave entrance in brilliant flashes and thunder echoing off the mountain walls. The horses were uneasy, and Beatrice moved to comfort them, stroking their necks and speaking in low, soothing tones. You're good with animals, Brody observed, watching her from his place by the fire. My father kept horses, she explained. I've been riding since I was a child. Brody nodded, adding more wood to the fire. The flames cast a warm glow throughout the cave, creating a small circle of light and warmth against the wild night outside. They shared a simple meal of jerky, dried fruit, and the last of the bread Brody had brought from Hangtown. The food was plain but filling, and Beatrice found herself more relaxed than she had been in days. Tell me about the judge, Brody said suddenly. What do you know about him? Beatrice set down her cup, considering the question. Ethan Hollister has been a judge in San Francisco for nearly a decade. He's known for his harsh sentences, particularly for crimes against property. The newspapers call him Hanging Hollister because of his fondness for the death penalty. Any family? A wife, I believe, though I've never met her. No children that I know of. He's involved in many business ventures: railroads, shipping, real estate. That's what Mr. Chen's evidence was about: Hollister's illegal dealings with the railroad to seize land in Chinatown. Brody's expression darkened. Land grabs against Chinese settlers. It's a common story these days. The law doesn't protect them the way it should. No, it doesn't, Beatrice agreed sadly. Mr. Chen was trying to prevent his community from being forced out to make way for a new rail yard. He had documents showing that Hollister had taken bribes to rule in the railroad's favor in previous cases. And now he's dead, and you're the only witness. Brody's voice was grim. Yes, Beatrice shivered despite the fire's warmth. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been better if I had just kept quiet, pretended I hadn't seen anything. No, Brody said sharply, surprising her with his vehemence. Never think that. What Hollister did was murder, plain and simple. And using his position as a judge to cover it up makes it worse, not better. The intensity in his voice made Beatrice wonder again about his past. You speak as if you've seen such things before. Brody was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and filled with a pain that seemed to reach across the years. 5 years ago, I was working as a deputy marshal in Arizona Territory. There was a wealthy rancher there, name of Marcus Delgado. He owned half the county and had most of the local officials in his pocket. Brody paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. Delgado had been forcing smaller ranchers off their land, sometimes by legal means, sometimes not. One family, the Millers, refused to sell. They had a small spread, nothing special, but it had been in their family for generations. Thunder boomed outside, but Beatrice barely noticed, captivated by Brody's story and the raw emotion in his voice. One night, Delgado's men rode onto the Miller property. They set fire to the barn, shot the livestock, and when John Miller came out to defend his home, they gunned him down. His wife Emma and their daughter Sarah were inside. Brody's hands clenched into fists. I was in town that night. I heard the shots, saw the fire in the distance, but by the time I got there, it was too late for John. Emma was badly hurt and Sarah was in shock. Emma told me what had happened, named the men who had done it. Did you arrest them? Beatrice asked softly. I tried. But when I went to the marshal with my report, he refused to act. Said there wasn't enough evidence, that Emma Miller was confused, mistaken about who had attacked them. I knew then that Delgado had gotten to him. The bitterness in Brody's voice was palpable. I should have done more. I should have gone over his head, found someone who would listen, but I was young, inexperienced. I followed orders. What happened to Emma and Sarah? Beatrice asked, though she feared she knew the answer. Emma died of her injuries 3 days later. Sarah was sent east to live with relatives. Delgado took the Miller land, and I. Brody's voice broke slightly. I turned in my badge and left Arizona, couldn't stomach being part of a system that allowed such injustice. Beatrice moved to sit beside him, placing her hand gently on his arm. You were young, Brody. You couldn't have known what to do. I knew, he said harshly. Deep down, I knew what was right, I just didn't have the courage to do it. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. That's why I'm helping you, Beatrice. Because this time, I'm not going to stand by and let a powerful man get away with murder. The raw honesty of his confession moved her deeply. Without thinking, Beatrice leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to his cheek. Brody froze, clearly surprised by the gesture. Beatrice drew back, suddenly uncertain, afraid she had overstepped. I'm sorry, she began, but Brody shook his head, cutting off her apology. Don't be, he said softly. His hand came up to touch her face, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek with a tenderness that made her breath catch. For a long moment they remained that way, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the storm raging outside. Then, slowly, carefully, as if afraid she might pull away, Brody leaned forward and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tentative at first but deepening as Beatrice responded. His hand slid into her hair, cradling the back of her head, while hers gripped the front of his shirt, drawing him closer. When they finally parted, Brody rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "I hadn't planned on that," he admitted with a small laugh. "Nor I," Beatrice replied, surprised by her own boldness, "but I'm not sorry it happened. Neither am I." Brody's thumb traced the line of her jaw. Though this might not be the best timing, Beatrice smiled, leaning into his touch. "Perhaps not. But I've learned recently that life can be unpredictable and all too short. Sometimes you have to seize moments of happiness where you find them." Brody's eyes darkened with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "You're a remarkable woman, Beatrice Conrad." They spent the rest of the evening talking in low voices beside the fire, sharing stories of their lives before they met, discovering the common threads that bound them despite their different backgrounds. Outside, the storm gradually subsided, leaving a peaceful silence broken only by the occasional drip of rainwater from the cave entrance. When it came time to sleep, they lay close together, sharing their blankets against the night's chill. Brody's arm encircled Beatrice's waist, holding her against his chest, and she marveled at how natural it felt to be there. "Sleep," he murmured against her hair. "I'll keep you safe." And for the first time since witnessing Hollister's crime, Beatrice truly believed that everything might turn out all right. Morning brought clear skies and a renewed sense of purpose. As Beatrice and Brody packed their belongings and saddled the horses, there was a new ease between them, a comfort in each other's presence that hadn't been there before. The trail was muddy and treacherous after the night's rain, forcing them to move more slowly than Brody would have liked. In some places, small landslides had partially blocked the path, requiring them to clear debris before proceeding. By midday, they had reached the highest point of their journey, Carson Pass. From there, the trail began its long descent toward the eastern slopes and the Nevada territory beyond. "We're making good time," Brody said as they paused to rest the horses. "If we keep this pace, we should reach the foothills by nightfall." Beatrice nodded, scanning the vast panorama spread out before them. From this height, they could see for miles forests and meadows, rivers winding like silver threads through the valleys, and in the far distance, the sage-covered plains of Nevada. "It's so peaceful up here," she said. "It's hard to believe we're being hunted." "Don't let the view fool you," Brody cautioned. "Hollister's men won't give up easily, and they know these mountains as well as I do." As if his words had conjured them into existence, a distant sound reached their ears, the faint but unmistakable rhythm of hoofbeats on the trail below. Brody tensed, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. "Get back on your horse," he said quietly. "We need to move. Now." They mounted quickly and continued along the trail, moving as fast as the slippery conditions would allow. Brody led them off the main path at the first opportunity, taking a narrower track that wound through dense forest. "Where does this lead?" Beatrice asked, ducking to avoid low-hanging branches. "It's an old trapper's trail," Brody replied over his shoulder. "Rougher than the main path, but less likely to be known to Hollister's men." They rode for hours, pushing the horses as hard as they dared on the difficult terrain. The sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon when Brody finally called a halt in a small clearing beside a rushing stream. "We need to rest the horses," he said, dismounting and helping Beatrice down. "And I want to check our back trail." While Beatrice tended to the exhausted animals, Brody disappeared into the trees, moving silently through the undergrowth. He returned 20 minutes later, his expression grim. "They're behind us," he confirmed. 4 men, maybe 5. They're following our trail, but they're still a few hours back." "What do we do?" Beatrice asked, fear coiling in her stomach. Brody considered for a moment, his eyes scanning their surroundings. "We have 2 options. We can keep moving, try to stay ahead of them and reach Carson City before they catch up. Or we make a stand here. Choose our ground, set an ambush." His voice was flat, matter-of-fact. Beatrice stared at him, stunned by the suggestion. "An ambush." "Brody, there are 5 of them and only one of you. 2 of us," he corrected. "You can shoot, can't you?" "I've fired a pistol a few times," Beatrice admitted, "but I'm no gunfighter." "Neither am I," Brody said with a grim smile, "but I know how to even the odds." He explained his plan. They would continue down the trail for another mile, where it passed through a narrow ravine. There, they would leave the horses hidden in the trees and take up positions on the high ground overlooking the path. "We don't need to kill them all," Brody emphasized. "Just discourage them enough that they turn back. Most hired guns aren't willing to die for their employer's cause." Beatrice wasn't convinced, but she trusted Brody's judgment. They mounted up and continued along the trail, the tension between them palpable. The ravine, when they reached it, was just as Brody had described, a narrow passage with steep, rocky walls on either side, offering perfect high ground for an ambush. They secured the horses well away from the trail and climbed to positions overlooking the ravine. Brody showed Beatrice how to brace her arm to steady her aim and reminded her to wait for his signal before firing. "Aim for the ground near their horses," he instructed. "We want to spook the animals, not necessarily hit the riders, but if they start shooting back." His voice hardened. "Then you aim to kill." The wait was excruciating. As the sun sank lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the ravine, Beatrice found herself replaying the events that had led her to this moment. Just over a week ago, she had been grading essays in her classroom. Now she was preparing to shoot at men who were hunting her through the wilderness. The sound of approaching riders broke her reverie. Brody touched her arm lightly, signaling for complete silence. Moments later, the first rider appeared at the entrance to the ravine, a stocky man with a bushy mustache, his hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip. Behind him came 4 more men, all armed, their expressions alert and wary as they scanned the terrain ahead. Beatrice recognized one of them from Hangtown, the man who had questioned Brody at the livery. Brody waited until all 5 riders had entered the ravine before giving the signal, a sharp, piercing whistle that echoed off the canyon walls. The effect was immediate. The riders reined in their horses, drawing their weapons and looking frantically for the source of the sound. That's when Brody fired his first shot, the bullet kicking up dirt at the feet of the lead horse. The animal reared in panic, nearly unseating its rider. Beatrice took aim and fired as well, her shot going wide but still close enough to add to the confusion. Gunfire erupted as the riders returned fire, bullets whining off the rocks around them. Brody remained calm, taking careful aim before each shot, forcing the men to dismount and seek cover. "Stay down," he called to Beatrice as a bullet passed uncomfortably close to her position. The gunfight continued for several minutes, a chaotic exchange of fire that echoed deafeningly through the narrow ravine. Beatrice lost track of how many shots she fired, her ears ringing and her hands shaking with adrenaline. Then suddenly, she heard a pained grunt beside her. Turning, she saw Brody clutching his left shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. "Brody," she gasped, crawling toward him. "I'm all right," he gritted out. "Just a graze. Keep firing." But the men below had seen their advantage. 2 of them began to move up the side of the ravine, using the rocks for cover as they advanced toward Beatrice and Brody's position. "We need to move," Brody said urgently, wincing as he shifted position. "Head back to the horses, I'll cover you." "I'm not leaving you," Beatrice insisted, tearing a strip from her petticoat to bind his wound. "This isn't a debate," Brody snapped, his face pale with pain. "Go." "I'll be right behind you." Reluctantly, Beatrice began to retreat, keeping low to avoid the bullets still flying around them. She had nearly reached the edge of the overlook when she heard a triumphant shout from below. "Got one of them," a voice called. "Keep pushing." Beatrice turned back to see Brody firing steadily, despite his injury. He was buying her time to escape, putting himself at greater risk to protect her. In that moment, something hardened inside her. She had been running for too long, afraid for too long. Without conscious thought, she raised her revolver and took careful aim at the man climbing nearest to their position. The shot rang out, and the man cried out in pain, clutching his leg as he lost his balance and tumbled back down the slope. The unexpected counterattack momentarily halted the advance of the other men. "Now," Beatrice shouted to Brody. "Come on!" Together they retreated, firing occasionally to keep their pursuers at bay. When they reached the horses, Brody was alarmingly pale, his shirt soaked with blood from his wound. "Can you ride?" Beatrice asked anxiously as she helped him mount his horse. "I'll manage," he said through clenched teeth, "but we need to put some distance between us and them before nightfall." They rode hard, leaving the ravine behind and taking a winding path through increasingly dense forest. The light was fading rapidly, and Beatrice feared they would soon be forced to stop, making them vulnerable to pursuit. "There's a trading post about 5 miles ahead," Brody said, his voice strained. "Run by a man named Jacob Fletcher. He's a friend. We can shelter there." Beatrice nodded, casting worried glances at Brody, who was swaying slightly in his saddle. The wound was worse than he had admitted, and she knew he was losing too much blood. The trading post appeared just as full darkness descended a sturdy log building with a small stable beside it. A light glowed in the window, a beacon of hope in the gathering night. As they approached, the door swung open and a tall, bearded man stepped out, a shotgun cradled in his arms. "Who's there?" he called, raising the weapon. "It's Weston, Jacob," Brody replied weakly. "Brody Weston, we need help." The man lowered his gun immediately. "Brody, Lord Almighty, what's happened to you?" He rushed forward as Brody slumped in his saddle, catching him before he could fall. Beatrice dismounted quickly, helping to support Brody's weight as they half carried him into the trading post. "He's been shot," she explained as they laid Brody on a cot in the corner of the room. "We're being pursued by armed men." Jacob Fletcher's weathered face hardened. "Hollister's men, I'd wager. Word's been spreading about a judge's men hunting a woman through these mountains." "Then you know what's happening," Beatrice said, surprised. "I know Ethan Hollister is a snake," Fletcher replied, moving to bolt the door. "And I know Brody Weston is a good man. That's enough for me." He helped Beatrice remove Brody's shirt, revealing the bullet wound in his shoulder. It was bleeding steadily, though not as severely as she had feared. "Bullet went clean through," Fletcher observed. "That's good, less chance of infection." He gathered supplies, clean cloths, a bottle of whiskey, needle, and thread, and handed them to Beatrice. "You know how to stitch a wound." "I've done some nursing," she replied, rolling up her sleeves. While she cleaned and stitched Brody's wound, Fletcher stood watch at the window, his shotgun ready. "5 riders approaching," he reported grimly. "Moving slow like they're tracking." Beatrice's hands trembled slightly as she tied off the last stitch. Brody was unconscious now, his face pale and drawn with pain even in sleep. "What do we do?" she asked, fear tightening her throat. Fletcher considered for a moment, then moved decisively to a trapdoor concealed beneath a rug. "Down here," he said, pulling it open to reveal a small cellar. "Used to hide goods from tax collectors in the early days. Now it'll hide you too." "What about you?" Beatrice asked as she helped Fletcher carry Brody's limp form down the steep steps. "I'll deal with our visitors," he said, a dangerous gleam in his eye. "Wouldn't be the first time I've sent Hollister's thugs packing." The cellar was small but dry, with shelves of preserved food and supplies lining the walls. Fletcher arranged Brody as comfortably as possible on a pallet in the corner, then handed Beatrice a lamp and a loaded revolver. "Stay quiet," he instructed. "No matter what you hear, I'll come for you when it's safe." With that, he climbed back up the ladder, closing the trapdoor and replacing the rug above it. Beatrice heard his footsteps cross the floor, followed by the sound of the front door opening. "Evening, gentlemen," Fletcher's voice carried faintly through the floor. "Something I can help you with." Beatrice couldn't make out the reply, but the tone was unmistakably threatening. She cradled Brody's head in her lap, one hand resting on the revolver Fletcher had given her, and waited. Voices rose and fell above them, growing more heated. Then suddenly, there was a deafening boom. Fletcher's shotgun. Shouts followed, and the unmistakable sound of more gunfire. Beatrice held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it could be heard through the floor. Beside her, Brody stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. "What's happening?" he murmured, his voice weak. "SHH," Beatrice soothed, stroking his hair. "We're at the trading post. Jacob Fletcher is, dealing with our pursuers." Brody tried to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. "I need to help him." "You need to rest," Beatrice insisted, gently but firmly pressing him back down. "You've lost too much blood." Above them, the gunfire had ceased, replaced by an ominous silence. Beatrice tightened her grip on the revolver, preparing for the worst. Footsteps crossed the floor again, then the trapdoor lifted. Beatrice raised the gun, only lowering it when she saw Fletcher's bearded face peering down at them. "All clear," he announced, his expression grim but satisfied. "Two of them won't be bothering anyone ever again. The others fled." Relief washed over Beatrice like a wave. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Fletcher helped her get Brody back upstairs and onto the cot. The wounded man was more alert now, though still weak from blood loss. "You took a big risk for us, Jacob," Brody said, clasping the older man's hand. Fletcher shrugged. "Been waiting for a chance to cross Hollister for years. Man's been squeezing honest folk with his corrupt rulings and land grabs. Besides, I owe you from that business in '67. He turned to Beatrice, his expression softening. "You two should be safe here for the night. Those who ran will likely head back to report to Hollister. We've bought some time." "We need to reach Carson City," Beatrice said. "Find Judge Reynolds." Fletcher nodded thoughtfully. "Reynolds is a good man. Fair, he'll hear you out." He glanced at Brody, concern evident in his eyes. "But your friend here isn't going anywhere for a day or two. That wound needs time to start healing, or he'll open it up again." Brody started to protest, but Beatrice placed her hand gently on his uninjured shoulder. "He's right, Brody. You need rest. And the delay might actually work in our favor. Give Hollister's men time to withdraw, thinking we've been dealt with." Reluctantly, Brody conceded. Fletcher prepared a simple but hearty meal of beans, bacon, and cornbread, which they ate gratefully. As they ate, he told them of other rumors he had heard that Judge Hollister was in Sacramento, personally directing the search for Beatrice, and that he had put a $500 bounty on her capture. "Dead or alive?" Brody asked grimly. Fletcher's silence was answer enough. Later, as Brody slept, Fletcher showed Beatrice to a small room at the back of the trading post. "It's not much," he apologized, "but it's clean and private." "It's wonderful," Beatrice assured him sincerely. After days on the run, the simple room with its narrow bed seemed like luxury beyond measure. "You care for him, don't you?" Fletcher asked suddenly, nodding toward the main room where Brody lay sleeping. Beatrice felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "We've only known each other a few days." Fletcher smiled knowingly. "Sometimes that's all it takes, especially when you face danger together." He paused, his expression growing serious. "Brody's a good man, one of the best I've known, but he carries heavy burdens from his past." "He told me about what happened in Arizona," Beatrice said quietly. "With the Millers." Fletcher nodded sadly. "That changed him, made him withdraw into himself. Before that, he was different, lighter, more open. This is the first time in years I've seen him truly care about something or someone." His words gave Beatrice much to think about as she prepared for bed. Her feelings for Brody had developed so quickly, born in the crucible of danger and mutual need. Was it real, or merely the product of their extraordinary circumstances? Yet when she thought of his gentle touch, the way his eyes softened when they met hers, the risks he had taken to protect her, it felt more real than anything she had experienced before. Beatrice slept deeply that night, secure in the knowledge that for the first time in days she was truly safe. When she woke, Sunlight was streaming through the small window of her room, and the smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air. She found Fletcher in the main room, cooking breakfast over the hearth fire. Brody was awake, propped up on the cot, some color returned to his face. "Good morning," he said when he saw her, a smile lighting his eyes. "How are you feeling?" she asked, moving to his side and checking his bandage. "Better," Brody assured her, though he winced slightly as she adjusted the dressing. "Jacob says we can move on tomorrow if the wound looks clean." Fletcher brought them plates of food, eggs, bacon, and johnnycakes smothered in molasses. As they ate, he outlined a new route to Carson City, one that would avoid the main trails where Hollister's remaining men might be watching. "It's longer," he admitted, "but safer. And I'm sending word ahead to Judge Reynolds through a friend who's heading to Carson City today. He'll be expecting you." The day passed quietly. Beatrice helped Fletcher tend to his garden and feed the livestock while Brody rested, his strength gradually returning. By evening, his fever had not returned, a good sign that infection was not setting in. After supper, Fletcher excused himself to check on the horses, leaving Beatrice and Brody alone by the fire. For a moment they sat in comfortable silence, the crackling of the flames the only sound. "I've been thinking," Brody said at last, his voice low and serious, "about what happens after Carson City." Beatrice looked up, meeting his gaze across the warm glow of the hearth. "What do you want to happen?" Brody seemed to choose his words carefully. "I've spent 5 years drifting, never staying anywhere too long, never allowing myself to form attachments. It seemed easier that way after Arizona, safer." He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. "But then I met you, and suddenly the idea of moving on alone doesn't seem right anymore." Beatrice's heart quickened at his words. "What are you saying, Brody?" "I'm saying I care for you, Beatrice, more than I thought possible after knowing someone such a short time." His voice was steady, but she could see the vulnerability in his eyes. "And I'm asking if, when this is over, you might consider a future where we're not running for our lives, but maybe building something together instead." Tears pricked at Beatrice's eyes, not of sadness but of an overwhelming tenderness. She moved to sit beside him on the cot, taking his hand in hers. "When I first saw you in that alley in Hangtown, I was desperate, exhausted, afraid. You could have turned away, protected yourself. Instead, you risked everything to help a stranger." She squeezed his hand gently. "How could I not care for a man like that?" Brody's free hand came up to cup her cheek. "Is that a yes?" he asked, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It's a yes," Beatrice confirmed, leaning forward to press her lips to his. The kiss was tender, filled with promise and the shared understanding of all they had endured together. When they parted, Brody's eyes were bright with an emotion that made Beatrice's heart swell. "I should warn you," he said with a wry smile, "I don't have much to offer. No land, no fortune, just a willingness to work hard and a promise to protect you always." "That's more than enough," Beatrice assured him, resting her head against his good shoulder. "After everything that's happened, I've learned what truly matters, and it isn't possessions or position." They sat together by the fire, talking of possibilities, of dreams long set aside now cautiously revisited. Perhaps a small ranch, Brody suggested, somewhere in the high country. Or they could go east, Beatrice countered, where she might teach again and he could use his skills in more peaceful pursuits. The specifics didn't matter, not yet. What mattered was that for the first time they were allowing themselves to think beyond survival, beyond the immediate danger. They were thinking of a future together. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect day for traveling. Brody's wound was healing well, and though he was still weak, he insisted he was strong enough to ride. Fletcher provided them with fresh supplies, 2 of his best horses, and detailed directions to Carson City via the route he had suggested. "It'll take you 3 days," he explained as they prepared to depart. "But you'll avoid the main roads where Hollister's men might be watching." He pressed a sealed letter into Beatrice's hands. "Give this to Judge Reynolds. It explains who I am and vouches for your character. Reynolds and I go way back." "Thank you," Beatrice said earnestly, embracing the gruff old trader, "for everything." "Just see that Hollister gets what's coming to him," Fletcher replied. "That'll be thanks enough." They set off as the sun was rising, following a narrow trail that led northeast through dense pine forest. Brody rode beside Beatrice when the path allowed, his presence a constant reassurance. The day passed uneventfully, the peaceful beauty of the Sierra Nevada a stark contrast to the violence they had left behind. By nightfall, they had reached a small meadow beside a clear stream, where Fletcher had told them they could safely camp. As Beatrice prepared their simple meal over a small fire, Brody sat watching her, a thoughtful expression on his face. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, noticing his contemplative gaze. "How strange life is," he replied. "A week ago, I was just passing time in Hangtown, waiting to move on to the next place, the next temporary job. Now here I am, planning a future with a woman I just met, facing down one of the most powerful men in California." Beatrice smiled, understanding his wonder at the swift changes in their lives. "Fate works in mysterious ways, my father always said. Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," Beatrice said softly, memories of her gentle, scholarly father filling her mind. "He would have liked you, I think." The next 2 days passed in similar fashion, long hours of riding through breathtaking scenery. Nights spent by campfires talking of their pasts and their hopes for the future. Despite the danger that still loomed, these were surprisingly happy days, filled with the growing certainty of their feelings for each other. On the third day, they crested a ridge and saw Carson City spread out below them in the valley, its buildings small but distinct against the backdrop of the eastern Sierra. "We made it," Beatrice breathed, relief and trepidation mingling in her voice. "Not quite yet," Brody cautioned. "Hollister may have men watching the town. We need to be careful." They approached Carson City as evening fell, when the shadows would help conceal their arrival. Following Fletcher's directions, they avoided the main streets, making their way to a modest house on the outskirts of town. A tall, distinguished-looking man with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard answered their knock, his sharp eyes taking in their travel-worn appearance and Brody's bandaged shoulder. "Judge Reynolds?" Brody inquired. "Yes," the man confirmed, his tone wary but not unwelcoming. "We have a letter from Jacob Fletcher," Beatrice said, offering the sealed envelope. At the mention of Fletcher's name, Reynolds's expression softened. He gestured them inside, quickly reading the letter while they stood in his modestly furnished parlor. "So you're the schoolteacher who witnessed Judge Hollister committing murder," he said when he had finished reading, his gaze settling on Beatrice. "And you, Mr. Weston, are the man who helped her escape." "That's correct, Your Honor," Brody confirmed. Reynolds considered them thoughtfully. "Hollister is a powerful man with friends in high places. Your testimony alone may not be enough to bring him down." "I understand that," Beatrice replied steadily, "but I know what I saw and I'm prepared to testify to it under oath." "And I can attest to the lengths Hollister has gone to silence her," Brody added. "His men pursued us across state lines, fired upon us without provocation. That's not the behavior of an innocent man." Reynolds nodded slowly. "No, it's not," he made a decision. "You'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow morning, I'll convene a special hearing. I have the authority as a federal judge to take your deposition and issue warrants based on your testimony." Relief washed over Beatrice. After so many days of running, of fear, the prospect of finally being heard, of seeking justice for Mr. Chen and for herself, was overwhelming. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Reynolds's stern face softened slightly. "Don't thank me yet, Miss Conrad. This is just the beginning of what will likely be a long legal battle. But at least here, you'll be under federal protection. Hollister's influence doesn't extend as far in Nevada territory." He showed them to guest rooms, where for the first time in days, they enjoyed the luxury of proper beds, hot baths, and a sense of security that had been sorely lacking during their flight through the mountains. The next morning, Judge Reynolds convened the hearing in his private chambers. A court reporter was present to record Beatrice's testimony, as was the local marshal, a stern-faced man named Harkins who listened with growing concern as Beatrice recounted the events she had witnessed. When she had finished, Reynolds questioned her carefully, probing for details, testing her recollection of events. Beatrice answered steadily, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "You understand the seriousness of these allegations?" Reynolds asked when he had finished his questions. "You're accusing a sitting judge of murder and corruption." "I understand completely, Your Honor," Beatrice replied, "and I stand by every word." Reynolds turned to Brody, who had been listening quietly throughout the proceedings. "Mr. Weston, do you have anything to add regarding Judge Hollister's pursuit of Miss Conrad?" Brody detailed their journey, the multiple attempts on their lives, and the deaths of two of Hollister's men at Fletcher's trading post. As he spoke, Marshal Harkins's expression grew increasingly grim. When both testimonies were complete, Reynolds sat in silence for several minutes, weighing what he had heard. Finally, he looked up, his decision made. "I find sufficient cause to issue a warrant for the arrest of Judge Ethan Hollister on charges of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and abuse of judicial authority." He turned to the marshal. "Harkins, I'm charging you with executing this warrant. Take whatever men you need, but understand that Hollister will not come quietly." "Yes, Your Honor," Harkins replied, clearly relishing the challenge. "As for you two," Reynolds continued, addressing Beatrice and Brody, "you'll remain under my protection until Hollister is apprehended. It isn't safe for you to be seen in public until then." For the next week, Beatrice and Brody stayed at Reynolds's home, waiting anxiously for news. The judge himself traveled to Sacramento with Marshal Harkins and a contingent of deputies to serve the warrant, leaving them under the protection of local law enforcement. During this time of enforced seclusion, their relationship deepened. They spent long hours in conversation, learning the small details of each other's lives that had been overlooked in the rush of their escape. Beatrice discovered Brody's unexpected love of poetry, while he was charmed by her skill at drawing, a hobby she had pursued since childhood. In the evenings, they would sit on the judge's back porch, watching the sunset over the mountains they had crossed together. It was during one such sunset, 8 days after their arrival in Carson City, that Brody took Beatrice's hand and slipped a simple silver ring onto her finger. "It was my mother's," he explained, his voice husky with emotion. "The only thing of hers I kept after she died. I've been carrying it all these years, never knowing why until now." Beatrice looked down at the ring, then up at Brody, her heart so full she could barely speak. "Are you asking me to marry you, Brody Weston?" "I am," he confirmed, his blue eyes earnest. "I know it's fast, and I know our future is uncertain until Hollister is dealt with, but I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Tears of joy spilled onto Beatrice's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." He gathered her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the love and promise that words could not express. In that moment, despite the danger that still lurked, despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, Beatrice knew with absolute certainty that she had found her home. Judge Reynolds and Marshal Harkins returned 3 days later, their expressions grave but satisfied. "Hollister is in custody," Reynolds announced as they gathered in his study. "He was arrested at his home in San Francisco." "How did he react?" Brody asked, his arm protectively around Beatrice's shoulders. "As expected, with outrage and threats," Harkins replied with a grim smile. "But when he realized we had federal warrants, he changed his tune quickly enough." "There's more," Reynolds added, his tone serious. "When we searched his office, we found documents relating to land deals in Chinatown. They matched your description of what Mr. Chen was trying to expose." "So there was evidence after all," Beatrice breathed, vindication washing over her. Reynolds nodded. "Enough to ensure Hollister will stand trial not just for murder, but for corruption and abuse of his position. The governor has already suspended him from the bench pending the outcome." "When will the trial be?" Brody asked. "It will be some months," Reynolds admitted. "These cases move slowly, especially when they involve men of Hollister's stature. But rest assured, Miss Conrad, your testimony combined with the evidence we found makes a compelling case." "And in the meantime?" Beatrice asked, thinking of the simple silver ring on her finger and the future she and Brody had begun to plan. Reynolds smiled, the first time they had seen such an expression on his usually stern face. "In the meantime, you are free to resume your lives. Hollister is in jail, his assets frozen. His men have scattered, most wanting nothing to do with a case against a federal judge." The news was almost too good to be true. After so many days of fear and flight, the sudden promise of safety, of normalcy, was overwhelming. "We were thinking of staying in the area," Brody said, squeezing Beatrice's hand. "Maybe looking for land to settle on." "A worthy plan," Reynolds approved. "The territory needs good people, especially those with the courage to stand up for what's right." 2 months later, on a crisp autumn day, Beatrice Conrad became Beatrice Weston in a simple ceremony at Judge Reynolds's home. Jacob Fletcher had made the journey from his trading post to stand as witness, along with a few friends they had made during their time in Carson City. Beatrice wore a gown of pale blue silk, a luxury she had allowed herself with some of the reward money that had been released to her after Hollister's arrest. Brody, standing tall and handsome in a new suit, watched her approach with such love in his eyes that she nearly wept with happiness. Judge Reynolds himself performed the ceremony, his usually stern demeanor softened by the occasion. When he pronounced them husband and wife and Brody leaned down to kiss his bride, the small gathering erupted in cheers. The celebration afterward was modest but joyful. As evening fell, Fletcher approached the newlyweds, a knowing smile beneath his bushy beard. "I hear you found a piece of land west of town," he said, clapping Brody on the shoulder. "Good grazing country." 20 acres with a stream running through it, Brody confirmed proudly. "The cabin needs work, but it's solid, and there's plenty of room for expansion." "Room enough for a family?" Fletcher asked with a sly glance at Beatrice, who blushed. "That's the hope," Brody admitted, his arm tightening around his wife's waist. Later that night, as they stood on the porch of the small hotel where they would spend their wedding night, Beatrice looked up at the stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. "I never imagined, when I fled San Francisco, that I would end up here," she said softly. "Married to a man I hadn't even met, starting a new life in a new territory." Brody turned her gently to face him, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "Regrets? Not one," she assured him, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "Every step of that journey, terrifying as it was, led me to you." "How could I regret that?" 6 months later, as spring turned the Nevada landscape to a riot of wildflowers and new growth, Beatrice received a letter from Sacramento. Judge Ethan Hollister had been found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life imprisonment. The evidence against him, combined with Beatrice's testimony, had been irrefutable. She read the letter aloud to Brody as they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. The cabin was no longer the bare structure they had purchased. Now, it boasted curtains at the windows, a garden beginning to sprout at the back, and furnishings they had carefully selected together. "It's over then," Brody said when she had finished reading. "Truly over." "Yes," Beatrice agreed, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on her abdomen where the first signs of their child were just beginning to show. "Now we can focus on the future." Brody followed her gesture, his eyes widening. "Beatrice, are you saying?" Her smile was radiant as she nodded. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby, Brody." Joy transformed his face as he gathered her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the love and wonder he felt. When they finally parted, both breathless and laughing, he placed his hand gently over hers. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For what?" she asked, though she knew the answer in her heart. "For running into that alley in Hangtown, for trusting me, for giving me a reason to stop running from my past and start building a future." His eyes shone with unshed tears. "For loving me enough to save me, in every way a person can be saved." Beatrice leaned against him, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The journey that had brought them together had been harrowing, filled with danger and fear. But it had led to this moment, this life they were creating together. "I love you, Brody Weston," she whispered, "and I always will." His arms tightened around her, solid and safe. "And I love you, Beatrice Weston, until my dying day." As darkness settled over the land, they remained on the porch, two people who had found in each other not just love, but redemption. The men who had wanted her dead were gone. Justice had been served, and the cowboy who had hidden her and faced them all alone was now her husband, her partner, her future. In the years that followed, their family grew first with the birth of their son, William, named for Beatrice's father, and 2 years later with a daughter, Emma, named in memory of the woman Brody had been unable to save in Arizona. The ranch prospered under their care, expanding as they acquired adjacent land and built a reputation for fair dealing and hard work. Beatrice eventually returned to teaching, establishing a small school on their property that served the children of neighboring ranchers. Brody, finding peace at last in the stability of their life together, became known throughout the territory as a man of integrity and quiet strength. And sometimes, on clear nights when the stars were brightest, they would sit together on the porch of their home, hands intertwined, and remember the desperate flight through the mountains that had brought them together. Not with fear or regret, but with gratitude for the love that had been forged in those dangerous days, a love that had endured, strengthened, and sustained them through all the years that followed.